Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our monthly EORE Hour webinar series. I'm glad you could join us today. This is Lubna Allen, the Secretary of the Explosive Ordnance Risk Education Advisory Group. And for those who are joining us for the first time, the EORE Hour webinar series is an initiative that has been ongoing for almost 4 years now. The webinars takes place the last Wednesday of every month, with some exceptions that we need some time. Each EORE Hour webinar, we have a host speaker that present on themes and topics that contribute to the enhancement of EORE. We have had over 10 webinars since the launch of the series, where EORE and related fields professionals from around the world present their projects, their expertise, their innovations, and together we exchange knowledge. And through this platform, we strive that the EORE community stays up to date with the latest knowledge and tools in the sector that are shaping the present and the future of risk education. For those who would like to review past webinars, you can check the recording. The recordings, they are online. The recordings of the previous EORE Hour and also this one is going to be uploaded after we're done. And it's on the EORE AG YouTube channel. And I have shared all the key links that you could use in the chat. If you yourself wish to host a webinar with us this year or next year, please get in touch with me via email, and I also have my email in the chat. So today's webinar is on measuring the impact of explosive ordnance risk education activities. So if you remember, if you were with us last April, we explored with Dr. Rob Keeley the delivery of knowledge as the output of EORE, and introduced the use of statistical tools as means to measure results of pre and post tests for statistical significance. Today, we are going to continue with him our conversation to dive into the use of standard method, the case control study, for measuring the impact of EORE, for example, its protective effect in helping to reduce casualties. So today's webinar will be around 1 hour. And as we go, please leave your questions in the chat, and Bob is going to get back to you during the Q&A. But after, like as we go, please keep them in the chat, and then we're going to get back to them. This will be followed by a 15-minute networking circle to give you the chance to make connections with one another and with other risk education professionals. So we hope that you will be able to stay with us for this part as well. So just a few logistical notes before we start. We kindly ask you to keep your mics muted during the presentation and to submit your questions, as I said, directly into the chat as we go. And in case of any technical issues, please send me a message in the chat, or you can contact me by email. So thank you very much. And Bob, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Lumber, can you hear me still?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So, Lubna, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for organising all of these webinars. As Lubna said, everybody, we're talking about a second part of our discussion, which is about measuring impact. And again, those of you who missed the first part, feel free to go back and look at that on the links that Lubna sent you. And if anybody has any questions about them, I'm very happy to talk about it offline. So to introduce myself, my name is, as you see, Dr. Robert Keeley, but just call me Bob. That's my name. So I've been around in mine action for more years than I care to think about. And so this presentation is based on experience and training from various people and sources. So let's start. We're going to have an introduction. We'll give the background of epidemiology. We'll talk about what case control studies are. We'll then talk about how to build a study, work through an example, and then finish by discussing the advantages and the limitations of this method. By the way, if anybody has a burning question, every time you see a green screen like this, it means I'm ending one of the sections, and we can always take questions on the way. If it's a burning one, or as Lubna said, we can wait to the end. So, an introduction. Let's talk about the scope. Our part one was already previously delivered, and that can be seen on this link. And part one, as Lubna said, measured outputs. I'm not going to go into detail to that. If so feel free to watch it on the YouTube link, and then if you have questions, come back to me offline and we can talk about it. This second part was planned to be in a James Madison University Journal article, but unfortunately, because of funding decisions in America, the journal is no longer being published. Well, certainly not at the moment, which is a great shame, but Lubna has given us the opportunity to discuss it here, so I'm happy with that. And so today we're going to focus on measuring impact rather than measuring outputs. Why do we need to do this? Well, what we're going to talk about today is an evidence-based process, and it will, I believe, give you a comparative advantage with donors. It means that you will have evidence about the efficacy of your risk education programs. And with today's uncertain funding, anything you can do to advance your case with donors has to be useful. So the aim today, we are trying to find a way of measuring impact that is evidence-based, objective, and is statistically sound. And so it's based on evidence rather than our opinion or our hope. Well, how do we know at the moment? Risk education isn't as easy to measure as clearance. We can measure clearance in square meters. We can measure our EOD tasks in the numbers of tasks, numbers of items we remove. We can easily measure risk education activity. How many people have we delivered materials to? How many handouts have we given? How many t-shirts have we printed? These things we can measure. We can measure the number of attendees. But we really need to be focusing on how to measure results. So, recognizing the problem, the Geneva Center published a global sector mapping and needs analysis, and this problem was recognized in that needs analysis, that we need to understand how to measure our results better than we currently do. What do we do now? Well, quite often we ask people, like this, how is my driving? We can ask people, and economists, we call this the stated preference problem, which is that people tend to give you what they think is the right answer. So we ask people to directly state their values rather than learning about their value from their actual choices. That's the economic perspective of this. People tend to give the right answer. This is also known to sociologists as something called the social desirability bias. If you ask people what they watch on television, they will tell you that they watch interesting, useful programs, not so much cat videos, for example, if they think that you're trying to, if that they think is the right answer. So this is a recognized problem generally inside social science. We can make it worse by asking vague questions. Do you feel safer? Why do they feel safer? Is it because of our risk education? Is it because clearance has removed the hazard? Is it simply because they have a better economic situation and they therefore have to take less risks? And there is also, unfortunately, the risk of bias of our own surveyors, particularly when these people are our own teams who are asking about their own performance. People do tend to be biased towards positive answers rather than negative answers. Let's talk quickly about the results chain. Inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, impact. These words, they're not standard in their definitions. Different organizations use different definitions for these things. So let's just get some common ground. Inputs are what we need. Activities are what we do. Outputs are our deliverables, what we're contracted to do, what we're paid for. Outcomes means a behavior change. An impact is its greater effect, its effect on health, its effect on wealth, or its effect on happiness. So let's go back to risk education and come up with a working definition. It's an educational process. It's in the name. It's explosive ordnance risk education. We are intending to reduce casualties from explosive ordnance, and we're doing that by helping people modify behavior. This also gives us 3 things to measure. So it's useful from a quality management point of view. Is it an educational process? Are we reducing casualties? Are we helping people modify behavior? Which leads to our theory of change. If people receive risk education and they understand what is communicated, then they will be more knowledgeable about risks and safer behavior. If they use this improved knowledge to adopt safer behavior, then there will be a reduction of casualties. What does that look like? Here's a results chain diagram. We discussed this before in the previous meeting, but it's worth just reminding ourselves that this is how the logic of this fits together. And what we're talking about today is impact. Are we reducing casualties? So the key question is, we talked before about whether we are delivering knowledge. Now we have to consider whether they are using that knowledge or not. There's some assumptions in this. If this is our theory of change, how do we know what's going on? Well, that's why we need evidence. Now we can get results from other projects. I did it in this country, I did it in this province, or I did it with this project. So therefore I can assume that it's going to work this time. We can also say pilot. We can run a pilot project. Will it work with the pilot? Therefore, I assume that it's going to work on a larger program. So, any burning questions so far? Excellent. Let's go into the background of this then. We're going to talk about any good conversation about epidemiology starts with talking about somebody called John Snow. He was an anaesthetist. He was an anaesthetist to Queen Victoria of the UK. And in 1854, there was a cholera epidemic in London. People at the time didn't know about germs, and they believed cholera was caused by a bad smell. But he was an anaesthetist. He was used to using things like ether and chloroform. And he realized that if bad smell was causing cholera, why weren't all the people who worked in the sewers of London, why weren't they dying? So he decided there had to be something else. There was this idea of something called miasma theory, that it was bad smells that was causing cholera. Germs weren't known, so that's how they'd come up with this idea that it was the smell. There was a correlation between bad smell, bad water, and cholera, but they thought it was a causal relationship. He was sure it couldn't be smell. So we're not talking about this John Snow, we're talking about this John Snow. As I say, he was Queen Victoria's anaesthetist. And he made this map. And this is a map of the cholera epidemic, and the black areas are, he measured the incidence of fatalities from cholera. They were all in this area, with one exception. And he worked out that every fatality, the closest water pump was this water pump on Broad Street. Now, there was one strange one over here, which he couldn't explain. And then he found out that the lady who lived way over in the west of London, she'd been brought up in this area. She'd married into a wealthy family, and she liked the taste of the water from this pump. She thought it was sweeter. So she used to send her maid every day to get water from this pump. And so when the pump became infected, she became a cholera casualty outside of the area. And the other strange thing was there was this brewery here, a place where they made beer, and nobody there suffered from cholera. And then he found out that actually what had happened was those people were allowed to drink free beer as part of their work. So they weren't drinking water, so they weren't getting infected with cholera. He then famously went to the pump, took the handle off, and the cholera epidemic stopped. And even today, the handle of this pump is preserved in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and John Snow is regarded as the world's first epidemiologist. So there is a definition, like in all good presentations, and this is from the World Health Organization. Let's just take the time to read this. So epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states or events, not just disease, but including disease, and the application of this study to the control of diseases and other health problems. Now, that's a big wall of text, but let's just look at these words: distribution and determinants, events, other health problems. Well, that's explosive ordnance casualties. So we can apply, under this definition, we can apply an epidemiology mindset to our problem of explosive ordnance casualties. Okay, that's the history of epidemiology. Any questions so far? Okay. Now let's talk about case control studies. Again, some background. This is not a new technique, and it's certainly not one that I invented. This is a well-established epidemiological technique. In fact, it was first discussed in the 19th century. Its first major use was on breast cancer in 1926. That's 100 years ago. And then the next major case was in 1950. And this is particularly important. It was 4 different studies made into smoking and lung cancer. And you can imagine that the tobacco companies weren't keen on any science that demonstrated that it was their cigarettes that was causing cancer. So this technique had to be robust if it was going to get through the courts, because you can guarantee that those tobacco companies took the scientists to court to fight this conclusion. It's what's known as an observational study. It's not experimental. We observe what's going on in the outside world and measure it. We are not experimenting. Now, this is the hierarchy of knowledge, and you can see that experimental is right at the top, and that's something called a randomized control trial. We're not doing that. We're doing something called a case control study, which is observational. It's analytical, and it's quite high up the system. Here we are. Also note where focus group discussions come in this. They are anecdotal discussions. So in terms of evidence, although we like focus group discussions as a way of adding qualitative context and depth and color to our work, in terms of hard science, case control studies are much more useful. So the structure. We start with a group of cases. So in our case, this is the people with the outcome of interest, which obviously to us are mine and ordnance casualties. Then we find a group of controls. These people have to be as similar as possible to the cases. So the same ages, the same genders, the same locations, essentially demographically identical. But these are people who do not have the outcome of interest. So they are the controls. Then we look at historical factors or exposure. What is it that the cases have been exposed to that the controls have not? Now, to quantify this, we use something called an odds ratio. This is the key to case control studies. And it's the odds of having a disease or an outcome with the exposure against the odds of having the disease without the exposure. If the odds ratio, and we will go through calculating it later, if it's less than 1, so if it's greater than 1, the outcome is more likely with exposure. For example, if you smoke cigarettes, you are much more likely to get lung cancer. If the odds ratio is less than 1, the outcome is less likely with exposure. So it's said to have a protective effect. Now, let's remember that, because that's what we're looking for with our work. But just take a second to think about an odds ratio that's greater than 1. The outcome is more likely with exposure. Now, we can all think of people, and I can think of my own grandfather, who lived to his 90s, smoked 60 cigarettes a day, never had cancer. And people will say, oh, yeah, but my granddad or my uncle or my aunt, they did this every day and they never had cancer. So it can't be true. We are talking about a ratio, an odds, a chance. We're not talking about here about things that are 100% guaranteed to cause something. What we're trying to do is find a trend, whether something's more likely or less likely to happen as a result of exposure. If the odds ratio is exactly 1, it means there's no connection with the subject. These things are not connected. But the lower the odds ratio, the more protective effect we have. Again, any questions so far? Okay, let's talk about how we put one of these together. We start with the population as a whole. This could be a country, this could be a province, this could be a particular group of people, whoever it is that you are interested in. It could be children, it could be adults, it could be women, whatever you decide that you need to study. So that's your population as a whole. And this is a retrospective study. We are going, the direction of inquiry is backwards against time. So we're looking at things that have already happened. We identify our cases, and we do that from something like a victim information system. Some countries have them, some countries don't. But this works where there is data available about casualties, and we identify the people who are demographically similar but who are not casualties. These are our controls. And then we look at, were these cases given risk education before they were accidents, or were they not given risk education? And we do the same for the controls. Had they been given risk education, or had they not been given risk education? So we have these 4 groups. Now, we had to structure. How do we structure this? As I say, we identify our target population, we identify cases, we identify controls, we interview the cases and the controls, and really the only question we're asking them for the purposes of the case control study are, did you have risk education before your accident, yes or no? For the controls, have you ever had risk education, yes or no? And in many respects, that for this purpose, it's the only question we need to ask. So, first thing, identify population. Second thing, identify our cases and our controls. And then ask them the question of whether they have or have not received risk education. It's very important for the cases, remember, to be asking the question, have you had your risk education before you were a casualty? This will give us 4 groups of people, A, C, B, and D. The importance of these letters will become clear in a minute. So here's our population. We've looked at our population, say this is a national population, and we've worked out that the ratio of casualties, and you can see the different types of casualties, is largely adult men with some adult women, with some very few boys and very few girls. So when we choose our controls, we're going to need to find people who are the same. So here are our controls. We find people under the same circumstances, the same village, the same ethnic group, whatever we're trying to look at, and we interview them in the same ratio. Again, adult men, adult women, boys, girls. For example, this is Ukraine. Myself and some colleagues were involved in a study of risk education for the Geneva Center in Ukraine 2 years ago. And this is the ratio that we found of casualties. 83% of the casualties in Ukraine were adult men. 8% boys, sorry, 8% women, 7% boys, 2% girls. Lots of reasons why that may be the case, but in my experience, this is a very similar ratio to in other countries. Now, there are some survey ethics questions here. We need informed consent, the same as you would when you're interviewing anybody. There is also a risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly with the casualties, and we do need to train our data gatherers in this so that they can recognize it and what to do about it. And there's also an ethical question about interviewing children. Interviewing children is possible, specialist organizations do it all the time, but we probably aren't training data gatherers to that degree of skill. So my advice is to interview young adults who had their accidents as children. So we ourselves are not interviewing the children. If, of course, you are a specialist yourself, or you're part of a specialist organization that can interview children safely, carry on. But if you're not, my advice would be to interview adults who had their accidents as children. Now, this is a training for a CAP survey, Knowledge, Attitude and Practices survey, which I did with our team here in Laos a couple of years ago, and here the team are being trained in the ICRC casualty patterns, and it took us about a week to train our data gatherers to go and do our CAP survey. I think that was the least amount of time needed to get the training over. And frankly, looking back on it, we could have probably done with a couple of days more. But the point being is that the teams do need to be trained. This is not something that you can just put together in an afternoon. Here's some, I've done this twice now. This was some data being gathered in Cambodia. And one of the things here, interviewing a casualty, as in here, carry out the interview somewhere where they feel comfortable, where they're not stressed. So here the casualty has been interviewed in their own house. We're not gathering them together in a village hall or something like that. We want the people, particularly the cases, to feel as comfortable as possible. Similar in our survey in Laos, interview the people one-on-one at home rather than gathering them together. Just one thing you notice here, that the interviewer at the top there, he's using a paper form, but we also tried using a tablet as well as a different way of collecting the data. That's another story. They both have advantages and disadvantages. So whichever your organization feels more comfortable with, do this on paper or do this with a tablet. And this is one of the casualties that we interviewed in Laos. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, let's work through an example. I'll give you a warning now. Some numbers may be involved. There's going to be a little bit of mathematics going on, but if I can understand it, I'm sure you can. Right, remember we've got our cases and we've got our controls. And we're asking them, as part of our CAP survey, we were asking them this one quick key question. Have you received risk education? Or did you receive risk education before you had your accident? And remember, we're going to get these answers. They were given risk education or they weren't given risk education. So here we have these amount of cases, these amount of casualties. They tell us that they were given risk education before their accident. And this group of cases tell us that they were not given risk education before their accident. Similarly, we interviewed the controls. These people tell us that they were given risk education, and these people tell us that they have not received risk education. There's all sorts of reasons why they haven't. You will know those as well as I do. And it's important to remember, okay, and I keep stressing this, it's for the casualties, it's, well, did you receive your risk education before you had your accident? Because that can confuse the data if we don't get that absolutely clear. When I give this class, as you know, in a face-to-face session, I would ask you at this point to think about why some people who have had risk education might still become casualties. So let's just take a few seconds to reflect for ourselves. Why is it? And this was a question we were asking Lau. Why did people who received risk education still become casualties? We won't find this out from our case control study, but it's still an important question. Why isn't it working? Well, I'm going to show you some real data at this point. But before this, I'd like to remind you all about these 5 categories of risk-taking behavior that were identified by UNICEF back in 2005. The unaware, the uninformed, the reckless, the intentional, the misinformed. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading these all out. Many of you will be very familiar with those. But the key point is these three groups here. I call these the problem groups because risk education is primarily about delivering knowledge. These three groups, the reckless, the intentional, the misinformed, some people say forced instead of intentional. I don't like the word forced. It sounds like somebody's got a gun to their head. That's not the right thing for me. And intentional is somebody who has no option, they think, but they have to adopt unsafe behavior, particularly farmers. They don't have a choice. So these people, the problem is not knowledge. The problem is what they do with that knowledge or don't do it. And I think this is these old UNICEF categories are really important in us understanding what we learn from this data. So remember our four groups, A, D, B, and C. We're going to make a calculation. There's A, B, there's C, and there's D. And this calculation is our odds ratio. And we're going to do something here called an exposure matrix. This is not Bob's invention. This is the standard methodology for case control studies. So this could be smoking and cigarettes. This could be 5G phones and brain cancer. It could be any of these things that people are trying to understand if there is a connective relationship between exposure and an outcome of interest. So if you are given risk education and you still become a casualty, you're group A. If you're given risk education and you're not a casualty, you're group B. And similarly, if you weren't given risk education, maybe you're a casualty, maybe you weren't. And that's the calculation we use. Let's go back to our example. This was our group A, people who received risk education and weren't casualties, people who received education and became casualties, controls who received risk education, and controls who have not received risk education. So we do the sums. In our groups, these are the numbers. That looks like this, which becomes this, which becomes 0.29. This is much lower than 1. So what this tells us is that risk education for this group of people that we've been talking about, the risk education has had a protective effect. So some people had risk education and became casualties, but nevertheless, overall, we can state with the evidence on this that our risk education, our results demonstrate that our risk education has had a protective effect. Now that's a very powerful technique. You remember earlier I asked, why do people who became casualties, why did they still have accidents? Well, we asked this question in our CAP survey, and these are the results that we got. We identified some things that we thought might well be problems, and so these are people we interviewed here, the casualties who had risk education before they became casualties. When we asked them, why did you have it? Why did you have an accident? And these are the results we got. Only 9% of our respondents gave an other answer, so I think we were reasonably good at identifying the possibilities. And it was interesting for me because the one that scored the highest is, I thought the area was safe. I thought the area was safe. So perhaps what that told us was maybe there was a disconnect between the way the risk education was given and advice about which areas had been cleared, which areas weren't clear, how to identify possible hazardous areas. So there's a lot that can be gathered from this, from the CAP survey as a whole. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, then let's go on to the final section, the advantages and limitations of case control studies. Let's start with the advantages. It's objective, it's scientific, it's an established method, not invented by the Mine Action Centre and certainly not invented by me, but it's something that has a very large pedigree. It's less susceptible to the stated preference problem or the social desirability bias because we're doing this scientifically. We're not just asking people. Also, what's interesting about case control studies is that it works in comparatively rare events. So we think that risk education, mine accidents are a terrible problem, and they are. But actually, in any one year, in most countries that we work in, even the most contaminated countries, there's tens or hundreds of accidents a year, not millions. So statistically speaking, these are quite rare events. But case control studies are quite acceptable in those circumstances. And compared to other survey techniques, it only needs a comparatively small sample. From my own experience so far, we need to be talking to around 100, 120 people to be confident in our results. Now, there is a handout for this presentation that Lubna's got, where I explain some of the statistical analysis or link to it in a bit more detail. We're not going to go into it here, but this is the sort of numbers based on the two examples the two times I've done this type of survey. We get better results when we've got these sorts of numbers. There are limitations. It's a retrospective study, which means we need casualty data. So this isn't so good in a brand new conflict where the data doesn't exist. And it's not so good in countries where the casualty data isn't collected. That is a limitation. We need to start with a baseline of casualties that we can interview. Now, the results are aggregated as well. It's another limitation in that in a situation where many actors are giving many types of risk education, this tells us overall that the risk education program is working or not. It doesn't tell us whether organisation A's risk education is better than organisation B. So we have to deal with that we have to deal with that with triangulation questions in our CAP survey. I can talk about that in a bit more in the next slides. So we may get different results in different provinces depending who's given the risk education in the different provinces. We need to separate out the different vectors for the delivery of the risk education. So it's best done when it's part of a CAP, because the CAP can help us do this. This is an example of a flashcard we used in Laos, where we put up all the organisations that were giving risk education in the country. And there's also in here one organisation that was working in mine action but wasn't giving risk education, is also on this slide. And we asked people to point to the logo of the people that they received their risk education from. And we knew who was working in the province we were working in, and actually the results were pretty good for this. We didn't get many people identifying random organisations for it. So this is one way that we've thought of trying to question, who's given the risk education. And we also asked the question of how did you receive your risk education? Was it community-based? Was it schools-based? Was it mass media? And then we listed the different types of mass media that were going on in the country. And again, only just under 6% of people came up with an other, which made us think that we were pretty good in identifying all the possibilities. And you can see here that community-based was the most common way people would receive their risk education, with some schools-based. So the conclusions. This is a recognized epidemiological tool. It's been used for more than a century. It's really not very complicated. It's objective and it gives quantitative results. It still does require minimum sample size, and it does require some training for data gatherers. And it can't on its own attribute different risk education initiatives. So we have to use other questions in the CAP survey to triangulate that. As a follow-up, as you've heard from Lubna, this webinar will be circulated. There's a handout. The full article will be published, the source in an alternative source. It's also part of a project management course that I run, I call Risk Education Level 3, which is the project management of community engagement. So I give that course. I've given that course a few times now. If anybody would like me to give that course for them, I'm very happy to discuss it. And I'll finish now, just inside my time, to ask if there's any questions. Over to you, Lubna.
I see Mike Berry has his hand up, so I'm going to mute him, and then we have Sebastian.
Thank you, Lubna. Thanks, Rob, for the fascinating presentation. Very interesting in terms of linking it back to epidemiology. I can never say that correctly.
Don't worry, Luke and I.
My question is on the statistical analysis and the regression when you're attributing causality. Because for example, if you have and just to be devil's advocate here, how do you eliminate your problem groups? So for example, if you're taking a sample which is composed of people who've had accidents but they're completely intentional, you can't therefore, by asking a binary question as in did you have EORE or not, you can't then link that there is no causal link between EORE and the result in the way I see it. How do you get around that from the statistical point of view?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm really, really glad you asked it. It's got two answers. The first is to be sort of pedantic about it. It's not attributing causality per se. It's identifying a protective effect. It's a trend. So whether this was smoking and lung cancer, it's like the story about my granddad smoking cigarettes till he was 90. It doesn't define a pure causal relationship. Mm-hmm. But it's saying is that there is a trend. People who have had this tend to be less exposed or less at risk than people who haven't, for example. And the other way of dealing with it is the triangulation in terms of the problem groups. I'm part of this, and we're not, this isn't the full discussion of CAP surveys, but that's one of the reasons why this is best placed as part of the CAP survey to understand which of these people you were. Were you intentional? Were you misinformed? Were you a teenage kid doing stupid things?
Yeah.
So that's how I'd answer that.
Absolutely, and sorry, yeah, thanks for that. And again, I think if it's all context for me. I'm a big context, and cultural context is really important from my perspective. Yes. So I think if you as part of it, it can certainly be a useful tool. Thanks for your answer. Thank you. Cheers. Okay.
Yeah, hi, this is Sebastian. Hi, Bob.
Yes.
Hi, Sebastian.
So my question is around, I have two aspects. The first one is like practical, how do you identify your control cases? So let's say it's at a province level, and you know you've had, I don't know, 50 casualties, etc. How do you identify the other 50 cases across the province? Which protocol, or how did you do that?
Oh,
And the
that's a
second
really
one,
so no,
just to,
okay. Yeah, go on.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, should we do them one at a time? That's
Yeah, let's go.
a really good question. The essentially what you've got to do is you've got to understand the demographics of your casualties. So, you know, for example, that data set we had in Ukraine, you would do something like that. You'd say, okay, I need to find 60 people who are divided in this ratio. This many males, this many females, this many boys, this many girls. That way, then I know that my data set is going to be representative of the types of people that I discuss. So then you have to go, and that's why one of the limitations of the reason that case control studies are only number 3 on that pyramid is that your cases are not purely random. They are what is available. Whereas a randomized control trial, the reason that's at the top is that would be totally random. A cohort study would be totally random, and it's one of the statistical limitations of a case control study is that your choice of cases is based on who you can find in your data set. But then when it finds the controls, which was your question, was
Yes.
what you essentially have to do is say, right, we know that we have, and this is what we did. We know we've got 60 cases. We know that we've got 7 in this village. We've got 9 in this village. We've got 12 in this village. Let's go to this village. There's 12 cases. How many of them can we actually find? Well, we've
Yeah,
found
that's
7.
important. So really the same villages and so on. So there's some comparison. Yeah.
And then essentially what we do is we snowball sample. We say, right, there's 7 casualties in this village. We've found 5 of them. There's 3 males, 1 female, 1 boy, 1 girl.
Sure.
We interview them, and then we essentially snowball until we find somebody who is similar.
Yeah.
And we did that in we did the province in Laos. We did this. We got our 120 within a week. So it's doable in a sensible amount of time.
Great.
I hope that answers your first question.
Yeah, no, very much so. I was thinking it's randomized, and then that's really pretty tough to do. And okay, good. The second one is, I think we can also apply this control study approach to another aspect of risk education, which is about identifying and reporting explosive ordnance safely. And it's a question we ask regularly in our RE pre-post surveys and so on. If you have seen something, what did you do, and so on. So we have our numbers, how many people have seen something, and I mean their replies and so on. But we could then do a control study as well on the same group to see how have other people reacted. Did they come across something, yes or no, etc. Does that make sense?
It could do. The only risk is if you're going to base this on they know what to do, for me, that is an output measure, that they know what to do, whether or not they've had your training or not. That's a measure of output. They have the knowledge. But remember, we have this problem with stated preference or social desirability bias. You would have to be measuring not what they say they know what to do, but whether or not they phoned it in or not.
There could be people who actually reported something so that we know that they did it.
Yes,
Okay.
that's what you have to be doing. You'd have to be measuring those people.
You have to be sure, yeah. Not just nice report. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
No problem.
Thank you very much. We have also a couple of questions in the chat.
Excellent.
Yeah, you can check them and address them.
That's I need to find the chat now. Look there.
It's down. You're going to find audio, video, participants. You can also stop sharing the screen if you wish to make it easier.
Let's do that. Stop sharing. Okay. Right. Where's the chat?
It's down in the
I
toolbar.
found it. I found it now.
Okay.
So Belinda's asked a question. Is it 60 and 60? Yes. Simple answer is yes. That's what we did in Laos, and it worked. I did less in Cambodia, and we had the data test wasn't. We had a problem with the statistical significance, but yes, it was 60 plus 60 in Laos, and that worked. Just going through these questions. Aisha, we've been doing risk education. We've been doing risk education in Northeast Nigeria. We still have people picking up. What do you think about the delivery? Do we need to change the approach? Well, Aisha, that's a really good question. As I say, we are still going to get the problem of that anyway, because of this problem. The social science call it a difference between, it's called the intention and action gap. I promise I'm going to give up smoking, but I don't. So there's a whole bunch of things in here, and this would need, to be honest, a lot more study than we've got time for in this question. But a case control study, which is what we're talking about today, would tell you whether or not this is an actual problem. Because that's why the protective effect calculation, the odds ratio, is so important. If we've got an odds ratio that's positive, that's good, it's less than 1, then we're going in the right direction. If it's 0, or sorry, if it's 1, and there's no value, then obviously something needs to be done. But there's a lot more to I think I'm not trying to skip your question, but I think that it's a bigger question than just a case control study. We know each other, Aisha, and I'm happy to talk about it offline, but just that we're going to be running out of time soon. Frederick, let me ask the question of survey fatigue. Yeah, survey fatigue is a problem, and there is an issue. I mean, with all sorts of problems with it. I mean, it's something I talk about on the course that I run. There's all sorts of biases that we face. One of the problems we have is tarmac bias. A very clever mapping person a few years ago worked out that motorist education in Cambodia was given very closely correlated to the location of karaoke bars. And that was a correlation. But the point was that the risk education was being done on the tarmac. It was being done in big towns. It wasn't being done out in the villages where it needed to be done. So that's part of the survey fatigue, that if you're in one of those popular places, then you're going to get survey fatigue problems. So it is a potential problem. Again, I don't want to scope the problem because we are getting short of our time. I'm happy to talk about it offline, but I don't know that it's that linked to case control studies per se, because we are already trying to evaluate our risk education. It's just that the techniques we use at the moment aren't very good. Sebit William, been delivering since several committees. Yes, as I say, we know that risk education doesn't prevent casualties, it reduces casualties. And part of the issue is these 3 problem groups. We are imparting knowledge, and we are helping people. We're helping people by giving them information so that they can make choices about safer behaviour. But we have to be constantly discussing the problem groups to find out whether we are targeting. This is why social and behaviour change communication is such an important aspect of risk education, because are we making a difference? Are we helping them cross that intention to action gap? Okay, I think I've answered, or at least replied to everybody's question. Again, if anybody wants to talk about me more offline, I'm always happy to.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bob, for this very resourceful presentation. Indeed, we gained first-hand insights from you on the rationale behind this tool in measuring impact and how useful it could be used to present the efficiency of EORE interventions to different stakeholders. Also, a big thank you to everyone who attended today. Thank you for joining us and for your engagement on the topic. And we hope that this discussion has provided you with approaches to consider in your work. So thank you very much, and I'll be communicating with you soon regarding our upcoming EORE Hour. And as we prepare for the transition into the next segment of our session, which is the networking circle, I will then stop